Welcome, 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 friend. I'm TK, your tour guide to the past, and you are listening to For the Love of History, the podcast where we talk about world history, women's history, weird history, and today we have two guests. Our second time that we've had two guests, but it is our first time that we are having some experts from a museum and a CEO, which is very exciting. So today we are talking with Kara Vetter, the Senior Director of Cultural Resources at the Museum of Us, and the CEO of the museum, Micah Parzen. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you both taking the time to talk with me.
Really happy to be here. Thanks for having us.
So we're across the ocean as we normally are at 7:30 in the morning for me. It's late in the afternoon for them. So we're just going to dive right into our topics today. So like I said, these two wonderful human beings are from the Museum of Us, which used to be called the Museum of Man. And today we're going to talk about the whys and the hows of changing the museum from the Museum of Man to the Museum of Us. So first of all, why was this decision made in the first place to change the name?
Kara, you want me to take the first crack at that one?
Yes, I do want you to take the first crack.
Okay, sounds good. I am the CEO, so I guess I'm largely responsible for that process. But really, TK, it was years in the making. I would say dating back to the early 90s when we first started thinking about changing the name, and there had been a serious consideration of that and ultimately voted down by the membership. The idea being that the phrase or the name Museum of Man was exclusive, didn't include women, kind of started to show up on the radar. And fast forward to 2017, so 27 years later, we knew that it was an issue we would have to grapple with. And prior to that, beginning about in 2010, we started down a very different path as an institution. And we adopted a very different kind of mission. We moved from the sort of old school preserve, interpret kind of mission to a much more contemporary and relevant one of inspiring human connections by exploring the human experience. And the deeper and deeper we got into how, as an institution, do we become more relevant to the community? How do we bring the community into the work we're doing? And so we are an institution for and by the community. The more we sort of leaned into our anti-racist and decolonial work. And over the years, we just started feeling like we weren't a Museum of Man anymore. And so we started down the path and ended up, after a very long process, with a name that is part descriptive of the journey we've been on over the last many years, but I think even more importantly, part aspirational. So a name that really pushes us to constantly be asking that question, what does it mean to be a museum that is truly for all of us and not just for some of us, the usual suspects of white, educated, wealthy folks who museums have long been designed, and particularly museums like ours that emerged out of the colonial endeavor, doing extraordinary harm to Indigenous and other communities of color. So ours has been a long journey, and the name change was a critical part of that process that gave us a springboard to the future as well.
That's excellent. Kara, do you have anything to add to that, or?
Not too much. No, you said it excellently well, Mike. But also, as part of the changes was sharing out about what it means to change. So we put together some publicly facing information, not only about the name change, so you can find that through we have a couple of slide decks through Google Arts and Culture that really kind of discuss the process and what that was like and the who, what, where, when, and why of it all. And then there's some associated slide decks that talk about our decolonizing journey that dovetail in with that give that information, deeper information about the why of it all as well. So that really helps tell the story and the history of what we've been doing for the last several years.
That's so fantastic. I didn't realize that it was such a community-based undergoing, that you were open with the community and telling them the different steps that you took in order to make this change. So having it be such a public change, was there any pushback that you received on changing the museum's name from the Museum of Man to the Museum of Us?
Yes, there was an enormous amount of blowback, both
Oh.
during the process leading up to it and after. You know, when we first announced that we were planning on changing the name, we didn't know to what. There were many people who engaged in sort of an outcry. How could you possibly? That's the museum I grew up with. It holds a very nostalgic and special place in my heart. And I actually got some very angry calls from very wealthy donors who basically said, you better watch your back. And if you change the name, you know, you may not have a job much longer, and another director will just change it back. And so, you know, there was a lot of upheaval around that, so much so that it sort of paralyzed us for a time. And it wasn't really until COVID, a few years into our process, that we decided that that was the time. Things were so topsy-turvy, change was in the air, everybody was having to adapt to different challenges. And we figured, let's rip the Band-Aid off. And we had read an article early on in the pandemic called "The Pandemic is a Portal" by Arundhati Roy, where she argues, it was in the Financial Times, and she sort of says, in the midst of all this pain and suffering, we have this amazing opportunity to emerge as a better version of ourselves. And we really took that to heart. And the name change was sort of a springboard through that portal and beyond. After the name change, the day we announced it, there was this amazing outpouring of love and support that just sort of buoyed us, and people were so excited and grateful and thankful. And of course there were many haters as well. And the Breitbart had picked up the story, and before we knew it, within 24 hours of the announcement, we were appearing on Fox News and Tucker Carlson, where he and a colleague were lambasting the name change as another example of woke cancellation culture run amok and political correctness at its worst. And our poor team had to sort of weather the juggernaut of hate that emerged out of that. But in many ways, it was the best thing that happened to us, because it allowed us to be very clear about who we are and what we stand for, and in turn allow others to sort of react to that relative to who they are and what they stand for. And, you know, we're convinced that that's really the role that museums should be playing today and going forward.
Yeah, I agree. Museums are not neutral places. So excellent. Karen, anything to add to that?
I would say that as we've been in this name for a while now, and it's been nice to witness as people walk through the park or engage in social media. It's allowed a different way for us to interact with the public in a less prescriptive, the museum says this kind of statement. It's more of a welcoming environment that's intended to be engaging and collaborative, and it's about, again, all of us. And so it's been nice to kind of watch as folks walk through the park and they're like, what is this? You know, and it's more of a question of interest and less of a what is a museum of man? Is it of men? Like, because it meant mankind, but language changes as it does. And we had different visitorship at the time. And so sometimes that didn't even translate to other languages well. You know, so it was just very confusing. So this is a more inviting to come in and learn about what us means and how we share that knowledge together.
Yeah, as a bilingual person myself, I speak Japanese. So thinking about translating the Museum of Man versus the Museum of Us into Japanese, it's two completely different meanings. So I love that name change. So what other iterations of the name were there before the Museum of Us was chosen?
Micah?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I mean, back in the 90s, they ideated, brainstormed maybe 200 plus names.
Wow.
And some of them were, you know, as wacky as can be, and others were like as traditional as can be. When we ended up moving toward the name change in earnest in the late, 2019, 20, around COVID and before that, we had sort of done a series of focus groups where we brainstormed lots of names. And, there were several that sort of kept rising to the top in terms of many groups would identify them. And the challenge, of course, is when you're trying to appeal to a lot of people, you end up kind of lowering to the lowest common denominator, right? And we ended up kind of deciding on 5 or 6 to test with the community. And some of them were kind of evolutionary, like the Museum of Humanity or the Museum of Humankind, kind of an incremental, inclusive expansion. And others were kind of revolutionary. You know, I'm not even sure I remember them. I remember one was the We, UE, like meet me at the We, you know, or hey, there's, you know, less museum-y and more sort of like, you know, happening kind of oriented. What was another one? They were sort of in that type of space. And the Museum of Us was a little bit on the, it was kind of in the middle, really. And it didn't test the best of any. The ones that tested the best were the incremental changes, right? Because change is so hard for folks. And then, you know, we ended up deciding on the Museum of Us, and a lot of people love it and a lot of people hate it, you know, and we got a lot of blowback on the specific name as well. But, you know, I think now, while there are still people who hold a grudge, most people have sort of moved on, and virtually everybody in our community knows that we've changed our name, and they probably have some opinion whether they share it with me or not.
Right. Exactly.
Kara, are there any names that you remember that stick out for you particularly?
I mostly just remember the We, because I liked it, and I liked the potential like mock graphic, because it was like a reflection show. It was like we, me. So you could kind of see how like us, but then I also was like, that may not be great for like vandalism, you know, and what folks might do with that. So I am glad that while I liked it, I'm glad we didn't go with it.
Fun in theory, not in practice. I'd love to know what the process was like for weeding out some of the maybe not mission aligning exhibits at the museum. So what was the process of taking out things? Was there reparations involved? Was there collaboration with community? I would love to know what there was.
So just kind of a pull back to like kind of like how museums operate, just so like the public knows. These exhibits take a long time to put together. They take a long time to put on. Many institutions usually have a years-long slate ahead of them of what they've got coming down the pipe. So for us, we've had that in various degrees, doing different plans and different exhibits over the years. And so for us, as we've been taking this journey into decolonizing practices, into anti-racism practices, we've been able to kind of peel off exhibits as they've aged out or timed out, or maybe, you know, it's just time for them to come down and start to be like, all right, well, we have this space that we know is going to be closing around X date, or we know the space is going to become available at this point. What is more mission aligned with where we are now? So like we had, when Micah, you first started, we put in the Beerology exhibit, we put in like the Monsters exhibit, and there were a few other things like that that were really brought in folks. And then as those exhibits started to age and needed to be replaced, we're like, well, we have this orientation towards, like I said, decolonizing initiatives and social anti-racism and social justice. So what kinds of partnerships, what kinds of exhibits would fit within this space and kind of start to help us build the narrative around what it is we want to be doing as an institution within the broader San Diego area, within the multinational region that we have. And so that process is long and varied. It depends on what idea raises to the top. Usually it's ideas that we have within our own team, but also we are approached on a regular basis by potential collaborators with an idea. It could be a fully fleshed idea. It could be just a nugget of an idea. And what does that mean? And so then we have these conversations internally about how might we bring this to fruition? What kinds of conversations need to be had? What other partners need to be part of the conversation to have a really well-rounded exhibit that discusses and examines the human condition in all of the different ways that we're hoping that exhibit might do for us. And so we've had a couple of different exhibits over the years, some that are still currently in place. So one of the ones that I'm thinking of most recently is the Hostile Terrain 94 exhibit that was done in collaboration and partnership with the Undocumented Migration Project. And it is all about the US-Mexico border and the policies that were put in place that really have pushed people to the outer edges of what is safe transit areas across the border back and forth. And what that unfortunately is meant the death and loss of life, because border policies stretching all the way back to the beginning, you know, of this country in many ways. But we didn't do that alone. That was done in collaboration with the Undocumented Migration Project. They went out there and they did lots of work, you know, not only looking to like drop supplies and do that kind of humanitarian work, but also they view part of their role as documenting like the actual people that are there. So they
Yeah.
would, and Micah, you can maybe talk a little bit about the workshops that are part of this project, but part of their effort is to not only do those humanitarian efforts, but to locate individuals who maybe have passed, and also any of the belongings that they may have had or that have been found in absentia of a person along the way. And they've operated in cataloging and documenting those really, really, really tragic stories, kind of humanize the fact that these are not just, ghost people that we don't know anything about. No, these are people that had lives and dreams and hopes and wishes, and that they were trying to come across for a better life. And what does that mean?
The core of the exhibit is essentially a box that the Undocumented Migration Project sends you, and the box contains 3,200 blank toe tags that would ordinarily be tied to the toe of a big toe of a corpse, and then a ream of demographic data. And the way it works, and this is sort of, we built an exhibit around this, but the core is this sort of part of the project where there's a kind of a rudimentary map of the United States and Mexico and the border. And you engage in these workshops where the community comes in and they transpose the data from the documentation provided onto the toe tag. So the name, the gender, the cause of death, where they were found, the condition of the body, and etc. And then once those toe tags from that workshop are all filled out with the corresponding demographic data, that toe tag is placed in the exact location that's geolocated to the place where that person's human remains were found.
Oh my goodness.
And so it's an extraordinarily powerful story that remembers these folks, as Kara was saying, who are so often relegated to the status of a statistic. And there are all sorts of interesting causes of death, and you find groups of families together. There's hypothermia, hyperthermia, but sometimes there's a lynching, right? Or a gunshot, or car accident, and so you imagine these stories where coyotes or families were making their way and something happened and they were abandoned or harmed and robbed and all the rest. So it's been a really important offering that we've been able to provide to the community to help folks see, the impact of policy on human life.
And then also in working with the Undocumented Migration Project to kind of build out this exhibit, there was opportunity for artist installations about, how they interact with the border and the ways in which that has impacted them. And then also we have a wonderful opportunity to work with an artist collective that is affiliated with the Decolonization Nation, who is bisected by the border. They're one of several Native American nations, both here along the southern border, but also Canada. Let's not forget Canada is a border as well, who are impacted by border policies and who are less able to, because of more restrictive and prescriptive border policies, to be able to cross for any reason, really. It's much, much more difficult for them to do so. And there are, hundreds, if not thousands of stories of tribal community members who have been unable to cross, or who have their sacred items that they use for ceremony down in Mexico confiscated by Border Patrol, even though they have all full permission to do so. So we were able to work with the Decolonization Nation artist group. They kind of created some imagery around native foods, native plants, and then also talked about how this is not a hostile environment to them, because it is their homeland. They know how to live, they know how to work, they know how to grow and to survive there and to thrive there. But because of the ways in which the border walls and the policies have pushed people into areas where they may not have traditionally gone, that's why we're seeing this increase in death and harm to migrants that are crossing as well. So we were really fortunate to be able to work with members from the Tohono O'odham Nation as well, to kind of make sure that part of that story is addressed, because they are here, they are living. This is their lands that we're talking about as well, and so they needed to be part of the story.
Yeah. One thing that I say all the time on my podcast is when we talk about Indigenous groups of people, we don't use the past tense, we use the present tense.
Correct.
So excellent. Micah, it looked like you were about to say something.
I was just going to say that what Kara and I've just sort of described goes deep into one exhibit and offering to the public, but it's really indicative of every exhibit and project we take on at the museum, that it's deeply centered around community voice and experience. And, our hope in working with community advisory councils and other types of elders and knowledge bearers and consultants, that through a process, we really are, flipping the script to, rather than, as Kara was saying earlier, being the authoritative expert, we're really ceding our authority to the community to define and drive everything about the exhibit from start to finish. We're sort of the guide, right? We know how museums work, we know exhibits and programs and the rest, but we're really just holding space for them to come out the other side where they really feel like the exhibit belongs to them and not just to us.
Mm-hmm. And
I love that.
And that does mean that creating an exhibit and any associated programming, it takes longer. For a lot of museums, like it's all done in-house, it's with their own collections, cultural resources, depending on what museum, the terminology changes. Mm-hmm. And sometimes things can happen relatively quickly, but this process, things take longer. You need to build consensus. You need to have conversations over many, many months, sometimes years, depending on what the topic is and how big, the project is as well. And so we've been learning as we've been going through this process that it takes time to build relationship. It takes time for people to feel comfortable talking to the museum, because even though we all know we're talking to each other as individuals, we still are a museum, we represent a museum, and there's all of this history that stands behind us of what our past practices are, what the industry, what the field has done historically, and that we're trying to change that, but it takes time to work to earn trust, to know that we're going in a different direction. So we're eternally grateful to all of the community leaders, all of the project developers that we've worked with, consultants that we've worked with to create these exhibits as we move forward, because that's the model for the future for us.
That's excellent. And to that end, I would love to know, what role do you see museums playing in like addressing social issues and fostering dialogue about diversity and inclusion? Like what is the museum's role in facilitating these types of things, if the museum has this type of role in the first place?
Kara, you want to?
Yeah, I'll start.
You go.
No, it's great. They have a lot of, well, not have a lot of role. It depends on what it is and what we're talking about. So they may have a large role to play, a small role to play. Museums are part of the colonial engine, the colonial endeavor. We were the marketing firm, the cheerleading arm in a lot of ways, to the victor go the spoils. And here are the cultural items and belongings from people who may or may not be vanished, but no one ever defined what vanished meant, that they're no longer here. And I was like, no, they were here. And so museums have this role to play in, I come at it from my unique perspective, being immersed in the world of cultural resources. That's where a lot of museums started, was their collections. They were built that way. And so a lot of it is sort of unpeeling the layers of how the belongings came to us, the pathways that they came to us, and having an honest conversation about what the actual history is, and then sharing that with consent, of course, of the community, depending on what it is, because we'll be doing this in concert, in conversation with any of the impacted communities, sharing that out more publicly so that it starts to hopefully change perceptions of what museums can and should be doing. Because for the longest time, like Micah was talking about before, to preserve, protect for museums, which is an important thing, but it's really about the experience and providing access to the information that museums have, and what does the community need from that. And when I say community, that could be the indigenous community, it could be descendant communities, it could be just the local community. There's a lot of different ways it goes, but I think museums do have a pretty big role to play, because we had a large role in the creation of the story that we have all been waiting in for the last several centuries. So I think we have a really big role to play. Micah?
I think that's great. Everything you said, Kara, I'm with you.
I think it's very refreshing. And I think a lot of my listeners are going to feel really happy, if anything, about hearing that, because I think a lot of them have this, there's kind of a weight around museums, like you were saying earlier. And it feels really nice to hear museums say like, hey, we understand the dark history of how museums started, but this is what we're doing in order to change that, to not forget the history, but maybe fix in a way as much as possible. So looking ahead, what are some of the future goals of the Museum of Us in terms of enhancing diversity and inclusion? Are there any upcoming projects or changes that either one of you are particularly excited about?
Well, I'm going to defer to Micah on issues of where we're going next, because you've got a more bird's eye landscape view. I have a pretty high view, but I want to make sure that, you know, the person with the biggest view can share a little bit more, and then I can kind of slot into where that is, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, Kara mentioned earlier what a slow moving process transforming a museum is, particularly from an outward facing perspective. So the Museum of Us, based on our anti-racist and decolonial work over the years and being kind of early adopters and willing to kind of truth tell and hold ourselves accountable and come up with concrete action plans for how we can do better now that we know better, we've really become seen as a leader in the field in these spaces. But our visitor experience hasn't really caught up with that leadership. So we still have vestiges of the old at the museum. I mean, we have a exhibit about ancient Egypt that doesn't fit for a wide variety of reasons. Other exhibits are in the process of being reimagined anew, but are still dependent on us fundraising to support the effort. So a major shift is sort of catching up to ourselves along those lines. And you know, a big piece of that, TK, is we've got some of these exhibits such as Race, Are We So Different, which will soon become Race, Power, Resistance, and Change. We've got an exhibit about Indigenous Kumeyaay experience on whose unceded ancestral homeland we're on. We've got an exhibit about colonial harm, focusing on the Maya diaspora and origin story. These are exhibits that bring up a lot for people, right? No matter who you are. If you are a Indigenous person or a person of color who often hasn't seen their own lived experience represented in museums in ways that feel good to them, it brings up a lot for you. If you're on the other side of the spectrum of you've never had your assumptions challenged about white supremacy, it brings up a lot. And if you're an ally, it brings up a lot too. How can I help more? And one of the things we don't do so well is preparing people for that bumpy journey. You know, basically, as an introductory sort of invitation saying, we're so glad you're here. You're obviously a curious person. You know, you're in the right place. Fasten your seatbelts. You know, we're going to bring up some issues that are going to touch some, you know, emotional chords for you. And we hope you'll join us on this journey with an open heart and an open mind. So we need to be better about that, and sort of, again, just catching up the visitor experience to the core values that the museum has evolved into adopt over time.
Yeah,
exactly. And then, you know, from my unique lens of cultural resources, you know, management and stewardship, we have a lot to do around how to educate the public about what stewardship means today, what museums can do, what they should be doing. There's been a huge shift in the last, you know, 10-ish, 15-ish years. It's been going on for longer than that. There's been a lot of work done by a lot of Indigenous community leaders, you know, persons of color and other descendant communities around what does it mean to have a voice in stewardship within cultural resources in particular. And so there's been this huge shift towards not only the idea of repatriation, which is the return of cultural items and ancestral remains back to the communities of origin, but also what does it mean for the items that remain that maybe the community isn't ready to accept or is not, or they do not wish because they do want the public to be able to access them. And what does that mean? Or maybe they're a diasporic community and they don't have a place for them to go. So what does that mean? And so these conversations of how do you do consented stewardship for your unique situation, for your institution, for the specific part of the collection that you have, or the whole collection, depending on what it is, has been a really big topic of conversation in stewardship circles for the last several years. And it's growing and growing, and guidelines are coming out, and processes and ways to do this are coming out. But the heart of it is around, again, that consent, those conversations with community, those honest and open and transparent conversations. And that's been a learning curve for a lot of organizations, a lot of institutions, is how do I talk to X and Y, Z Indigenous community about something that's really awful? And I was like, don't ignore it. Don't ignore the problem. You need to start somewhere. And it usually starts with an apology and then an honest effort to work towards redressing in whatever ways the communities state. And so it kind of goes hand in hand as we do this work, with the foundational collections and then all of the things that stem up out of that, then it's also how do you educate the public about this as well, and why maybe a museum may not be interested in your great uncle's, point collection because maybe they already have, a lot of them, but also maybe the home community or the home nation might like them back. So how do we facilitate that conversation?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of there.
Yes. There's a lot of moving parts in museums and the business of repatriation and decolonization of a museum. So I'm really excited to see the things that the Museum of Us has in store for the future. Hopefully someday I will be able to get out there to California. It's the closest state to Japan. So someday. So thank you so much for coming to speak with us today. I have one fun little question for you. We've talked about some heavy topics today. So my last question of the day for you is, what's your favorite museum to go to? I know it's a tough one.
I love sculpture parks. I think it's because I grew up near one. There's Lumiere Sculpture Park in St. Louis. I'm from the Midwest originally. And I would spend many, ill-spent youth, misbegotten youth, my parents, this was the 90s. My parents didn't know where I was, tooling around, sculpture parks and having fun and hanging with my friends. But I think that's where I really started to appreciate what art can do in public settings that is less rarefied. And it's more like art is an adventure. It's an experience. And not to say that you can't get that in a standard art museum, but I found being able to interact in these really fun and quirky and offbeat ways to be really, really, clearly it stuck with me as well. And how do you bring that into maybe an indoor exhibit or a more traditional space? What does that look like? It's not the area that I work in, but I do have feelings and thoughts about how that could happen, clearly.
Yeah. Speaking of sculptural parks, I lived in Virginia for a while, and I lived literally right next to Big Head Park is what I call it. It's the presidential park with the giant heads. So I love that stuff.
Yeah. And I tried to follow the signs, don't climb, but people at St. Louis don't use this against me. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Micah, how about you?
Yeah, interestingly, very similar to Kara, I think, in terms of museums that kind of are quirky and flip the script and kind of surprise you. You were talking about St. Louis, Kara. Like, I think the City Museum in St. Louis is one of the best experiences around. It's a children's museum for adults, essentially, with all sorts of wacky ideas. But I did just come from back in May, went to Baltimore for the American Alliance of Museums conference. And for the first time, I was able to go to my new favorite museum, and that is I think it's called the American Visionary Art Museum. Ooh. And it's in Baltimore. It's essentially a museum of outsider art. So these are folks who are self-taught, who didn't have formal training, weren't part of the kind of highfalutin art world. And, many of them struggled, were in contexts of poverty or perhaps challenged in mental health, relative to mental health. But, they just produced these wonderfully powerful and raw and unique pieces of art that just kind of stop you in your tracks and really make you reflect on kind of the extraordinary and the ordinary, which I think is a really powerful reframing of how we typically think of genius,
Yeah. Those are excellent recommendations for all of our listeners. And if either one of you ever come to Japan, might I recommend the Ekingura Ukiyo-e, the woodblock print museum, because it is a museum in a tiny town in Kochi that's close by me. And you hold a lantern to view horror woodblock prints. So it's really cool. It's a completely dark museum, and you hold your little lantern and you view the images via lantern light like they were supposed to be viewed. So if you ever find yourself there,
sounds great.
Just give me a call.
Fantastic. All right. It's on the list, TK. Thank you.
You're so welcome. Thank you both for coming on today. I am sure my listeners are just absolutely ecstatic after hearing this episode. And blah, 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 blah. Sorry, I got a little flustered there. Thank you so much for coming on, and I will see you in the outro. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you once again to Kara and Micah for coming on to the podcast and talking to us. I had an absolutely wonderful time chatting with them, and I hope that you enjoyed listening to our museum chat. And if you are anywhere near San Diego, or if you are looking to road trip to a museum, might I suggest the Museum of Us, along with the other museums that we talked about today. You know, if you, maybe with the exclusion of the one in Japan, it might be a bit of ways to get on over here to Shikoku. But hey, if you're in the area, come on over. As you know, we are in the off season. I am preparing for season 10, so just some quick little housekeeping here at the end of the episode. If you haven't already, please consider leaving a rating or review. That helps so much in supporting the podcast. If you haven't yet, go on over to YouTube, subscribe. We got some fun stuff coming on over there, and it's always fun to see faces. If you'd like to support the podcast in other ways, you can join us over on Patreon for early episode releases, ad-free listening, and so much more. If you'd like to get your hands on some super duper cute merch, you can head on over to the show notes, and there is a link to the merch store. The stickers, the Chibi History stickers, are available now. Those will be updating soonly as I create more stickers. They are very, very, very cute. So if you want to get yourself some cute little chibi historical lady figures from history, you can go get those stickers because they're really, really stinking cute. And I think that is about it. I'm gonna tell you to drink your water, do something kind for yourself. I know this week it's just a little bit stressful with the elections going on, okay? Please make sure that you take care of yourself, drink your water, go outside, touch some grass, and I will see you next week for an archived episode release. Oh my gosh, what is it gonna be? What do you think it's gonna be? I don't know. Yes, I do know, but I'm not gonna tell you. Okay, I will see you next week. Love you. Bye.